Hello, my name is Silas Bowman. Later, next, you'll be meeting Felipe Van Horde, Mateo Montoya, Obi Mundue, and Diego Van Horde. And then Mateo Montoya will also wrap up at our conclusion as well. So, today our team is exploring one of the fastest growing trends in consumer finance, buy now, pay later, BNPL, has reshaped the way young people shop, budget, and borrow. But it has also introduced risks that many consumers, lenders, and even regulators didn't see coming. Our goal in this presentation is to unpack both sides of the BNPL boom, the convenience that makes it so appealing, and the hidden dangers that make some experts compare it to the early stages of the subprime crisis. So now we'll go over our agenda. Here's the roadmap for our presentation. We'll start with the rise of BNPL and why it's considered a shift toward what we call invisible credit. And then we'll analyze different business models used by Klarna, Afterpay, and PayPal. And those strategies impact profitability. We'll also examine systemic risks, especially loan stacking and the consumer impact on Gen Z, and financially vulnerable buyers. Finally, we'll wrap up by assessing the long-term outlook in the industry and what regulatory changes may be needed. So, this comes to our question: what are BNPLs? Buy now, pay later is a short-term interest-free installment loan offered at a checkout by companies like Klarna, Afterpay, and PayPal. And instead of paying the full price up front, consumers split the purchase into 4 equal payments over 6 weeks. Approval is almost instant, usually with very minimal screening and, importantly, no traditional credit. For consumers, BNPL feels effortless and cost-free, but the business model works because merchants pay a fee of around 2 to 8%. To BNPL providers, in exchange for high conversion rates and large order sizes, it becomes extremely popular with young shoppers who avoid credit cards, and today it has grown into a 680 billion market that is starting to rise regulatory concerns. So, why did the industry boom? Good question. There are several reasons BNPL exploded in popularity so quick. First, the pandemic accelerated online shopping, and consumers wanted more flexible payment methods. BNPL fit perfectly into that shift. Second, Gen Z and millennials embraced it because they dislike credit cards, want no interest financing, and love the instant approval experience. Third, e-commerce platforms benefited from BNPL. It dramatically reduces cart abandonment and increases average order values, so retailers actively promote it. Fourth, there's a psychological element. Paying in 4 small installments feels much more manageable than paying a large amount up front, even if the total cost is identical.
Profitability of buy now pay laters. On this slide, I'm comparing three major BNPL players, Klarna, Afterpay, and PayPal. And the key point is that their profitability and risk profile depend heavily on how lender-like they are. Starting with Klarna, they showed a strong rebound in 2023, including their first profitable quarter in years at a much smaller net loss. But what also tells us is Klarna is still very sensitive to credit conditions. When credit losses rise, especially in the US, or when funding gets more expensive, profitability can swing quickly. So even if growth is strong, the business can wobble because they're exposed directly to default and financing costs. Next is Afterpay, which is owned by Block. On the surface, it looks like a success story, big revenue, contribution, strong growth, and a massive merchant pipeline. But the big warning sign here is what happened after the acquisition. Large write-downs and impairment, which signals Block likely overpaid relatively to the long-term value they can extract. Even if unit economics are improving, the purchase price creates pressure. Block needs sustained performance to justify that investment and higher borrowing costs that make it harder. Finally, PayPal. Approaching BNPL more like a platform. That's PayPal. They're scaling volume quickly, but they are doing with an asset-light strategy, often selling BNPL receivables to external investors. So compared to the other two, PayPal is trying to keep growth while moving a meaningful portion of credit risk of its own balance sheet. So the financial risks of the buy now pay laters. This table ties those business models to the primary financial risks. For Klarna, because it's more asset heavy, the biggest threats are straightforward: credit loss risk and funding cost risk. If customers default, that hits profits directly, and if interest rates rise, Klarna cost of financing increases, so the margin on interest-free offers gets squeezed. For Afterpay or Block, the risk set is a little different. One major risk is acquisition impairment, as I said before. The write-downs are financial sign that the expected future cash flows didn't match the original purchase assumptions. The second is more operational because the model still has a real lending exposure. Block faces credit risk plus the ongoing cost of funding, which becomes more painful when rates and capital costs rise. For PayPal,
So buy now, pay later apps don't share their data with each other and they don't share them instantly either. And this creates a layer of pretty much a void where no company knows what is happening with another company. So whenever there's no shared data, it allows borrowers to max out one buy now, pay later app and then transition to another app, open it and open an account and do the same thing there, bouncing from app to app without having any limits. And the real danger isn't necessarily that the lenders can't see the full picture of their borrowing accounts, but it's more of the fact that due to so many of people having multiple loans open, it limits the amount they're able to pay back to each app. So, for example, 63% of users have multiple loans open at the same time, and 33% actively use multiple apps like Klarna and Afterpay. Now, with some of these demographics, we can see that 65% of Gen Z uses BNPL apps, which means that the market is driven towards borrowers with limited credit history. And 57% of the users, they use BPNL apps because they can't afford the item. So it's allowing them to spend more than they can afford. And because they weren't able to afford the item in the beginning, it just adds up to how much they would have to pay later and includes the interest. And what we've also seen is that the users usually have a credit score under 580, which is a low credit score. So the demographics for BNPL users are people who normal banks would usually turn away whenever they ask for a loan. And due to the issues of stacking and not being able to see their data, it creates a void for them where they'd be in an endless loop of having to pay back debt since they can't properly track the amount of loans that they currently have open through all the apps.
like the like the rent, auto loans, credit cards, compared to people who don't use these apps. Specifically, 18% of buy now pay later users are currently 30 plus days late on other bills, compared to a stable baseline of just 7% of non-users. So, why is this happening? It's not necessarily that these users intended to default. The problem is the mechanism itself. We call it loan stacking. It's when a user has 4 payments on Klarna, 4 on Afterpay, and 4 on PayPal. It kind of creates a chaotic web of due dates, and in fact, 31% of users admit they simply lose track of what they owe because it's too much, and it starts as a quick fix, but often ends up making their financial situation much, much more fragile. To see who's actually getting hit the hardest by this trend and by these kinds of companies, we actually have to look at our own generation. Young adults are the heaviest adopters of these services, and the reason is what we identified as the liquidity gap. So, unlike other adults, most students like me and recent grads have limited credit card limits, but they do often carry significant student loan burdens. This restricts their purchasing power by a lot. So buy now, pay later apps have become essential to this group because they sort of act as a bridge for them. But the data shows that this bridge is carrying a bit too much weight. For young borrowers, buy now, pay later loan balances now account for 28% of their total unsecured debt. That is way, way higher than the national average. So essentially, because traditional banks have restricted access, young people are now using these buy now, pay later apps to leverage their future income just to make ends meet today, either for rent or for other bills or just to buy a sweet treat or something at the mall. I'd like to draw your attention to this graph right quick, specifically focusing on the green bars, which represent the 18 to 24-year-old demographic. So this visual perfectly illustrates what we mentioned before, called the liquidity gap. If you look at the credit cards cluster on the left, you'll see that the green bar is tiny compared to the older age groups. So this confirms that young people had very restricted access to traditional credit card lines with traditional banks. But if you look at the student loan section on the right, the same green bar skyrockets. So here, this is the reality for this demographic. They're entering the economy with massive fixed debt burdens from the student loans, but almost no flexible spending power from credit cards. So this imbalance is why buy now pay later apps have taken off so quickly. It acts as a necessary bridge for a generation that is effectively locked out of what is known as a traditional credit card system.
So our consumer survey collected 50 responses, with 48 completing the attitude questions. The goal was to measure not just whether students use buy now pay later, but whether their usage show risk signals like stacking multiple plans, missing payments, or not tracking balances. Our sample is mostly undergraduates, juniors. They're the largest group, and credit card ownership is already common, with roughly 2/3 reporting at least one card in their name. Adoption is relatively limited in our sample. Only 20% reported using buy now pay later in the last 12 months. That suggests buy now pay later is currently a secondary tool rather than the main payment method for most students, at least based in this data set. Within buy now pay later users, most are light users in terms of number of apps. 80% use one app and 20 use two, but we still see a meaningful stacking signal. 40% reported having two or more active plans at the same time. Stacking matters because it can hide the true monthly payment burden and make a user vulnerable if their income falls or expenses rises. On repayment, only 10% of buy now pay later users reported being late or missing a payment, but the balance question reveals more nuance. While most report owning zero, one user reports owing 500 or more, and 20% are unsure of what they owe, which signals tracking and budgeting gaps. Attitudes reinforce the risk narrative. Many respondents agree buy now pay later makes it easier to overspend, and respondents generally do not view buy now pay later as a safer alternative than credit cards. Overall, buy now pay later isn't widespread in our sample, but risk is concentrated among a subset of users. The strongest warning signs are stacking multiple plans, not knowing total balances, and perception that buy now pay later drives overspending. These are exactly the patterns that can produce subprime, like stress during an economic downturn. Even if missed payment rates look low today, our key limitation is that buy now pay later user sample is only 10 people. So we treat these results as directional, but the risk signals are clear and aligned with the broader regulatory concerns.
To wrap up our presentation, I'd like to leave you with what is, for us, our final verdict on the industry as a whole. First, on the business models, the industry is clearly split. We do believe PayPal's asset-light strategy is the winner, because by leveraging their platform to sell loans to investors like KKR, they protect themselves from risk. In contrast, Klarna's asset-heavy model, where they keep the loans, leaves them incredibly vulnerable to interest rate hikes and credit losses. Second, on the systematic risk, the primary danger isn't just one person defaulting on their debt, it's the shadow debt, because these apps don't share the data they have, so a layer of this invisible debt is forming. With